Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap. I'm really excited about this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, our sponsors, Orca Security, will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 6 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is how I achieved security discipline and governance across AWS, Azure, and GCP. Our speakers today are Jack Roehrig, who is the CISO at Turnitin, and Patrick Pushor, who is the technical evangelist at Orca Security. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today. Okay, so I believe Patrick, well, actually, Jack, why don't we go ahead and start with you? But before I let you introduce the topic and what you're going to be talking about today, I'm going to just put myself on mute and take myself off camera and let you guys just get right into it.
Right on. All right, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about some interesting challenges with the overlap of DevOps and security and how Orca can help with those. So I have a lot of DevOps experience, I've got a lot of security experience, and I can bring those two things to the table to help you out in both disciplines.
Fantastic, and my name's Patrick Pushor, Technical Evangelist here at Orca Security, and it's my pleasure to spend with you about the next hour getting to know Orca, but also, as many of you, I'm looking forward to hearing from Jack and his perspective from the field. So just before we get there, I'm going to share with you a high-level perspective around Orca. So Orca provides workload-level security for AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. After an instantaneous read-only and impact-free integration to the cloud provider, Orca detects vulnerabilities, malware, misconfigurations, lateral movement risk, authentication risk, and insecure high-risk data, and then prioritizes that risk based on a lot of environmental context, concepts like host configuration, networking, permissions, and a lot more, all without deploying agents or network scanners or really any ops code at all. So Orca is able to achieve all of this through a really novel approach to discovering these risks that we call side scanning. Orca makes use of the separation of the compute and the storage services on the public cloud to deep dive into the storage associated with your workloads and mine for risks. The process is out of band and it doesn't affect your important workloads at all, and is equally applicable for instances or virtual machines, Docker containers, containers as a service, such as EKS or ECS on Amazon, and even storage buckets. So after side scanning, the sort of second pillar of secret sauce, if you will, behind Orca is context. So we combine the side scanning generated intelligence with cloud metadata, data like which security groups cover your workloads, how traffic is routed in your virtual networks, and quite a bit more. And so Orca discovers all of those cloud assets, identifies the roles that those assets play, identifies connectivity between assets, how each are connected, which are public facing, taking into account all those networking conventions, some of which we already talked about. And then and only then do we start to identify vulnerabilities with all of that context. So let's look at a really quick example. We're going to underscore this in the demo at the end of the webinar. But if we look at a typical approach to vulnerability management, we have two different kind of vulnerabilities here. For the sake of argument in this example, let's say they're the exact same kind of remotely exploitable vulnerability. Any traditional approach to this problem would see these two vulnerabilities in server 1 and server 2 and would grade them the same. After all, they're the same vulnerability. But Orca takes a bit of a different approach. We too see the same vulnerabilities, but we'll take this healthy dose of context and apply it, meaning that server 1, because it's internet facing, receives that high risk sort of score. Server 2, because it isn't, and because it's only reachable from one other source, and that source is not the public internet, it gets downgraded to a lesser severity, a medium risk alert, right? It's not that neither of these are unimportant, but which one will you address first? And this is a theme of Orcas that we'll talk about through our webinar today. We feel really fortunate for a company that's just under 2 years old to be able to show you the customer spread that we do. And it's not just here. If you take a look at the website at orca.security, you will find that we have 9 case studies, which, for a security company is impressive. For a security company under 2 years old, I think is really impressive. So we take a lot of pride in that. And we talk a lot about Orca in comparison to sort of the old way of managing vulnerabilities with agents, but network scanners, both authenticated or not, as well as CSPMs or cloud security posture managers, are also part of the kind of modern toolkit we think about when you think about cloud security. Orca combines the very best approach to deep workload discovery with side scanning, an approach that represents tens of orders of magnitude less effort than the traditional approach with agents, combines that with a lot of environmental context, right? With no impact to your workloads and really unprecedented visibility into the risks associated with such. And we're going to talk about all sorts of things that Orca finds in the next hour. So with that, let's turn things over to the man of the hour. Jack, how you doing out there?
I'm great. I'm the guy that you have to listen to for the next hour. My apologies. First and foremost, I'm a beauty school dropout. That's my best credential that I have. That's a long story. Find me on LinkedIn, ask me about it. It's weird. I'm weird. Anyways, I've been doing this for 25 years. I started in the industry very young, and I've been doing information security and DevOps roles concurrently for just about that entire time. I worked for a very large multinational company and greenfielded information security programs for many different companies, subsidiaries. And I always held those DevOps and security roles. And when I worked in M&A, it was a unique complement because I was able to use my security leverage to sell my DevOps products. So I've really learned a lot over the years about how to get DevOps and security to work well together. I am a huge data privacy nerd. Please don't tell any of my friends that. I'm not ashamed of it, but if they found out, they'd think different of me. And I have a very strong passion for an ethical impact. So the company I work for is Turnitin, which, as you probably know, is an ed tech company. It's very dissimilar from my employment history. And I do that because my role there is able to have a positive influence on students who depend on us to pursue their careers throughout their life. Let's do the next slide. All right. So my verticals, there's a bunch of them. I'm not going to go over them all. The company I worked for did a ton of different stuff. So I've had experience with all these different compliance regulations, weird nuances of PII and personal data, all sorts of things. And from a DevOps perspective, it's also given me experience with seasonality, which is a huge issue that we face. All kinds of interesting company ages, right? So if you've been in DevOps for a long time, you know how hard it is to acquire a company that has a very large monolith and acquiring a company that has a very small cloud deployment, different skeletons in different closets. Next slide, please. All right, so Turnitin. I bet a lot of you know what we do. And not everybody likes us. I'm guessing most of the people here like us, but Turnitin is a similarity detection platform. We determine who's plagiarizing what. We do a whole lot of other things, but the core of our business is similarity detection. And when I joined Turnitin, I was under the impression that it was just essays. I was told it was just essays. I actually took the job as kind of a break from a very fast-paced career. And then I learned that it was not just essays. We index the internet like Google, which is not a big deal, but I'm a huge search nerd, so that's fascinating to me. We also have a product called Authenticate that advertises itself to government customers, corporate customers. We store classified data in our systems from various foreign national governments. We store pre-patent information. We store medical research pre-FDA approval. Companies that produce these kinds of intellectual property need to make sure that it's original. If it's not original and they spend the money to make it go to market, they're in a lot of trouble. Well, that's all in my database. So go on to the next one. Yeah, you can move up to the next one. Yeah, so we got 1.3 billion submissions in this database. 150 countries, tens of millions of users. But some of those, as I was saying, submissions are so sensitive. I've learned that I'll give you one example, and I don't like to talk about these details because they're obviously sensitive, but I have reason to believe that people are submitting classified government data because they have requested certain compliance from us that we have told them we were not going to get. You could probably all guess what that is, and they continue to use our product. I also was on a call somewhat recently, and I heard that there might be some sensitive data from a particular country that is targeted by another particular country, and the country targeting that particular other country is very good at espionage hacking. So fun, yeah, it was a really big slap in the face, but also it was a really awesome challenge because I was right about ready to get back into things. And we have no advertisers that Turnitin, so I can still maintain an ethical privacy regulation at TAI. We have so PIPA, COPPA, FERPA that we have to deal with, and about a ton of other acronyms for ed tech regulations. They're generally all pretty bad. Education technology privacy regulations are not very good. But of course, we have to deal with GDPR, and today is the day, everybody, CCPA. It's July 1st. It's Enforcement Day. It's a national holiday in California. And dozens and dozens and dozens of other regulations. These regulations are wonderful because they are not very prescriptive. They have a spirit associated with them. So a person like myself working for a company like ours can follow these regulations without having to do a lot security related, but they allow me to motivate employees at the company to prioritize security. So let's talk about data privacy and security in education just for a sec. For those of you who don't work in ed tech or who haven't had a lot of experience working with technology in education, you might not be aware of how under budget these institutions are and how large they are. But when I was younger, and I'll confess to this, I'm sure the statute of limitations is over, it's 2020. I used to target, when I would hack around, because that's how you learned, right? I would target universities. And I targeted universities because their security was weak and their infrastructure was huge. I actually was applying for colleges a while back, and I decided to hack all of the ones that I applied to. I did not successfully hack the one that I got into, so don't rescind my diploma, please. I got into UC Berkeley in about 5 minutes. That was an external vulnerability that got me into their ls.berkeley.edu server, which was their main website. So they have high bandwidth internet, it's great for DDoS. The modern hacker is looking for resources, right? They're not just trying to educate themselves. They're not trying to search for bounties. And these education consortiums, companies, they can't keep up with their software. Students abuse their infrastructure. They're huge targets. So next slide. All right, let's talk about how Turnitin has grown over the years. Turnitin is something that I try to market as the private and secure academic integrity company. And when I joined Turnitin, they had a security program, but I was not satisfied with it. So I decided to greenfield, which means I scrapped most of it. Now, if some of you are on this call, you probably know if I thought your security program was awesome, and some of yours were, so don't take any offense to that. But we did a complete greenfield. We did a reboot. In 2019, we were acquired by Advanced Holdings from a 4-year private equity investment. And if anybody's ever done that or understands how this type of M&A works, a 4-year investment is kind of like a flip, like flipping a house. And a company like Advanced is a long-term strategic investment that provides you with what I like to refer to as a variable length runway. Well, the 4-year company doesn't really care about risk as much as the variable length runway does. So the priority for security has gone way up, which is awesome because that's what I do. But what's not terribly awesome is that this is coupled with a very tricky cloud migration that is very substantial. Our AWS bill is, of course, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, and we're just now onboarding customers. Our onboarding process requires customers to adopt. We do not shift them. So it's you can imagine when I have this massive on-premise infrastructure and then this massive cloud infrastructure, my attack vectors the whole perimeter, the scope of the risks has increased, not doubled, but by much, much more than that. Let's move on to the next guy. So our customers are extremely passionate about data privacy. These customers are encouraging their students to submit all of their works. Well, not encouraging, they're requiring them to submit all of their works to our system, and they're stored there indefinitely. People misunderstand how we manage that data. Some people have assumed that we retain intellectual property rights of that data. We absolutely don't. We don't sell the data. We don't use the data for purposes that it's not intended to be used for. And of course, people hate us because if we call them out on plagiarism, they're expelled from school. And so we get the occasional death threat. People threatening to show up to the office with a gun. I think I have it here somewhere. Oh, it's right here. This is a funny one. At the office, I carry a taser gun because of threats that we've had in the office. Now, obviously, this is not going to stand up against an active shooter situation, but that's the kind of company Turnitin is. We are a huge risk, despite the fact that you wouldn't think we are. And coupled with that, we have an extremely complex data infrastructure. It's delicate, it's difficult to maintain, it's maintained by an oligarchy of brilliant people. It's difficult to unsilo that knowledge, and so our governance and separation of duties is not very good. So Patrick, let's do the next guy here. All right, so what do? We built a holistic program. A holistic program means that we didn't focus on application security or technical security. We focused on everything. Physical access controls, awareness training, all that kind of jazz. We put culture into security and security into culture. So the way we did that was by making security fun. I sent out some really fun phishing campaign emails. One of them that I love is a refrigerator camera email where I say that people are stealing food from the office, so I installed a webcam, and it's just so silly. It has one of the highest phish rates I've ever seen. So, you know, if this career doesn't work out, I can always go to the dark side. I personally onboard every employee, and I don't have to do that. It's something that I love doing because I get to introduce myself to everybody, and I get to let them know there's nothing to be ashamed of. If they're hacked, if they're phished, they can come to me. And it also gets the security and the culture from the get-go. And this is really important because I can implement all the controls and governance and policies and technology that I want to, but if security is not embraced by the company, if the people don't embrace security, they will subvert it. They are smart, right? They're gonna do it. So we have to make it fun. And it is fun. It's not hard to make security fun. We all love security, right? Maybe it's just me. But also I take it, right? Maybe it is me. I don't know. I think it's like people seem to enjoy it. Maybe they're just, you know, being nice. The risks, go on.
No, it's a good point, and I was sort of curious. You talk about fun and gamification, you know, kind of making this more interesting than security typically is. I mean, how else do you build that culture? Do you look for that kind of person in hiring? I know you mentioned you spend time with every employee, which I think is outstanding. Maybe, you know, maybe that's the way to get them to see security as more than something that gets mentioned on day one, right? And forgotten about. But, you know, how do you build that culture going forward and maintain it?
So one of the things that I do as a CISO is, and this is one of the bullets here too, I take this risk-based approach. I don't tell people what to do. I tell them what the risk of what they're doing is, right? I think that a CISO's fundamental role of a company is not to police, unless it comes to audit. Now we have personal liability there, right? We can't be dishonest, but it's to expose risks, right? So a lot of people view security folks as obstructionists. And being that I worked in DevOps for so long, I also view myself as obstructionist sometimes. So, I mean, I have to battle myself. It's really weird. I'm not insane, I swear. But this unique perspective that I've had from DevOps, you know, leads me to approach security in a way that people can consume and think is reasonable. But that's just part of it, right? I think you have to make security fun. I've sent out so many goofy emails to the company. One of them, my IT team took this, and the IT team does not report to me. They just did this out of their own volition. But I did a badge cloning email. And for those of you that don't know, it's very easy to clone those little badges we carry at work unless they use more sophisticated technology than most businesses use. And it's actually a common attack vector, especially where our office used to be headquartered, which was in a pretty high crime area. So I sent out an email to the company titled Burglary 101. And it was an instructional how-to break into an office, pose as somebody else, clone their badge, and then steal assets. Obviously, tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic. My HR department hated it, but it was fun and it made an impact. And it's something that I do whenever a new company joins my security program, or I join a new company and build a security program for them. I try and do a fun thing. So culturally, I'm getting people excited about security. And in my Tiger team of security folks, it's not just tech people. I have a guy from marketing who has a great deal of experience doing business in China, which is also one of my specialties. And he's joined my security Tiger team to assist with those issues. We have people from all different types and areas of the company that love to participate. The CEO of Gradescope, one of our acquisitions, and our current chief strategy officer, Arjun Singh, he and I talk about security, relatively frequently, and he takes a personal interest in it. It's awesome. I mean, I've never worked at a company where people have valued security the way that Turnitin does. So the cloud solutions at Turnitin, this is what I alluded to earlier. The migration that we've been doing has lasted for years, and I'm sure most people here have gone through a cloud migration or gone through a cloud migration back to data center migration. Don't get me started on all that. But it's complicated. And the way it usually works out is you start prototypical. You have an AWS account that everybody has access to, and they build things, and then those things turned out to be codified in production. So it increases a lot of risks, and one of the ways that we need to manage those risks is to become aware of them. So I have a stack, and this is not everything. This is just some of the more interesting stuff. But Orca Security is relatively new to my stack, and it's, I'd say, the best thing in my stack. I have a host-based IDS, which I think is critical to complement Orca. And Orca, I hope, will be building one of those soon with their side scanning technology, because I'll get into that later. White Source is something that I think approaches the CI/CD pipeline well. I know it's an old school tech, but I really like their company. I used them for some M&A a while back, and I'm working on getting them implemented right now into our CI/CD. Various tools and services around the cloud, like smaller things here and there, to audit AppSec. AppSec, of course, is something that is very difficult and complicated to manage deterministically, right? Application security is very complicated, and it's also one of the more difficult things for a CISO to manage. It also, believe it or not, I think is one of the lower risk attack vectors that we suffer from. And of course, what is absolutely critical is a strong, decent configuration management system. Without such a thing, exposing the risks just exposes a ton of work to do. With a system like that, it's a manageable amount of work. Let's talk about what Orca does for us. Now, I don't usually do evangelism for companies. Those of you that know me well probably know I'm extremely cynical. I'm kind of an asshole, but Orca, when I entertained Orca at RSA last year, and I'm ashamed to say that, I go to RSA just to talk to new companies, all right? I'm not attending the conference, but Orca sold me like in 5 minutes. It's really amazing stuff. I don't invest in Orca or anything like that. I'm completely unbiased when it comes to this. They're not paying me to do this, but they enable me to identify risks in ungoverned cloud accounts, which is huge. The PII, personal data stuff that they detect, allows me to kind of gain a little bit of governance about my segregation of duties and data access segregation. The compliance requirements that they satisfy are very helpful. Now, obviously, I've already built all these tools out, but when I do audit, I like to have redundant things in case the auditor's like, well, you know what, this year, that's not going to work because I'm in a bad mood. I can be like, boom, Orca does this. There's my backup. I'm good. It routinely governs bad behavior. It enforces sane credential use. I think Orca has a weak password detection system that involves a breach database, which I freaking love. Breach databases are cool. I'll talk more about that. And it discovers assets. I mean, I know that's pretty easy to do in a cloud environment, but when you have dozens of cloud accounts across multiple different cloud infrastructures, you don't always have time to log into them all, right? And Orca has an logging infrastructure that helps. But I think the biggest thing that Orca does is risk profiling, and Patrick mentioned that earlier about the risk aggregation that Orca does, and it makes it consumable, which is great for M&A due diligence, because you don't submit a report of 4,000 vulnerabilities in an M&A report. You need a high-level summary of stuff. Orca does that. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of those things in a little more detail. Orca is agentless. Patrick mentioned the side scanning technology. It's freaking awesome. If you are not in charge of your DevOps team, if you are a DevOps team and your security guys are asking you to install this, it takes like 2 minutes to install an AWS. It's like lightning fast. I make my team POC so much stuff that they've made fun of me for it. And the other day I was meeting with one of my managers and he said, yeah, Jack's always, making us look at this stupid software and wasting our, he's tongue in cheek, of course, I hope. But when I had them look at Orca, I asked Devin, I said, well, how was the install? Devin's one of my engineers. And he said, dude, it took like 2 minutes. I was like, really? Wow, okay. So I logged into the thing and I took a look at it and it was there. It took them 2 minutes to install and it was done. But it profiles all of these machines, whether or not I have access. It's agentless, right? So if you're running an HIDS, if you're running a system that requires an agent to be deployed, you're deploying it on your known assets and you're deploying it on your assets that are managed by your configuration management system. Those aren't your risky assets. The ones that are risky are the ones that you're going to discover with Orca.
Right.
Let's move on to the next guy here.
Sure. Maybe just before we do, you talked about how big of an investment you have in AWS, and it makes perfect sense. It also looks like you dabble in the other platforms as well. How important is it to have a single tool that sort of looks at more than one platform, or maybe said in a different way, did you look at the capabilities kind of each of the big three in terms of what you were looking for?
That's a great question. So we don't use GCP and Azure for very much. Actually, if you look at my Orca account, you can see on the slide down there. Is it down there? I don't know where you guys see it, but you see it says GCP Creature Workshop. I have no idea what that is. It sounds weird, but there are 300 and something of those. 300 and something. I don't know what they all do. And in the Azure accounts, they're mostly for managing Bing search. So it's like, well, what do I need to put software in there for? I need to put software in there because people have access to those accounts that could do anything in there, and those accounts might have access to our RFC 1918 space or some other sensitive area in our infrastructure. So it's important for me to watch what pops up on those. And Orca, like I said, has an alerting infrastructure, so I can be notified of those things. That's a great question, though. It's the multi-cloud. The multi-cloud function of Orca is excellent because a lot of people are multi-cloud, even if we all think we're not. Like a lot of us still have Azure and GCP that are doing something, or maybe we're all GCP and we got something in AWS. It doesn't matter if it's small. It matters what's capable of happening in there, and having the elimination of risk is key. All right, so the risk aggregation I touched on earlier, but I like to call it aggressive data granularization. You know what? I don't like to call it that. I can't even say it. But Orca really does boil up the risks well. And like every security company says that they do this, right? They're like, oh yeah, we present to you a dashboard where it's just the stuff that you want to look at. We have ML and AI and we do all that. No, Orca doesn't. They do cross-correlate. If your web server that has an RCE vulnerability is not public facing, it's going to have a lower risk than one that doesn't. And this is a snapshot at one time of when we installed Orca across very many environments at Turnitin. As you can see here, it has 11 imminent compromises. And I know what those things are, and they are legitimate. And then look at the other numbers. They're huge, but they're not a big deal to Orca because they've cross-correlated against all these different factors. Now, I'm no Orca expert, so Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm not going to get too into specifics, but from my perspective, I want the hazardous, I want the informational. I'm a hands-on CISO, but I'm also a hands-off CISO. I don't have a lot of time to do that stuff, so I also want the imminent compromise thing, and I need that to present to my executive teams so that I can get more funding, I can get more money to mitigate these risks and help the students.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've heard of the dreaded alert fatigue. This is where it comes from, right? If we didn't do that classification, if we didn't do that contextual enrichment, then we just had this flat list. And how do I know, if I'm sitting in my SOC or my NOC and I'm watching these screens of alerts, how do I know the ones that are, truly kind of represent imminent compromise versus those that, maybe vulnerabilities to which a fix isn't even available, right? It's really, really key, I think, for sure.
Yes, it's prioritization, and it's not so much just like I don't know which is which. I mean, I've managed DevOps for a long time, and I love DevOps engineers. I'm a DevOps engineer. I mean, obviously, like I eat, breathe, and sleep DevOps, and I've been on call. I've been in the front lines. I've been in the war zone, and I know what it's like getting. a ton of alerts, and eventually it's just like, I don't know what to do, right? Like I've got 16 alerts that are coming in. Who knows which one's important? It was a big problem at Turnitin too. That one of the things I first did there was to try and minimize those alerts. So
Absolutely.
the PII identification is neat. The data segregation risks that this exposes are really critical to Turnitin, because I consider the PII, or not PII, but personal data, I'll call it. PII is kind of an antiquated term. But just to be very clear, Orca does discover PII because discovering personal data that would be a very hard thing to do algorithmically. But PII is a subset of personal data, and that's the stuff we care about the most. And Orca illuminates it to me. It shows me when it's sitting on a machine somewhere, and I can get an idea of who's doing what with it, and if they should be doing what with it, and if they shouldn't have access to it. And I can walk over to their desk and intimidate them. I guess I can't do that anymore because we're all stuck at home. But when we're all back in the office several years from now, I'm coming for you guys. I'm just kidding. Let's move on to the next one here. So yeah, this is kind of in the same vein as what I was talking about. People do stuff that they're ashamed of in production, always. Like sudo su dash, right? I mean, we've all done that. Or perhaps putting their password in their shell history, which, I mean, it's a risk, certainly. Yeah, it poses a lateral attack risk. But you know what else it does? It makes me this omniscient CISO that can go and ping people when they're doing it and make them think that I'm watching a whole lot of other stuff that they do. Okay, I have a funny side story here that's kind of analogous to this. A long time ago, I was learning Russian. I don't know why. I thought it'd be fun. It's very hard. It's a fun language to learn. I highly recommend it, but it's a hard one. So I'm at a little party. I think I was in like college freshman year, and there's this friend of mine who was a Russian woman and a friend of mine who was a Russian man who didn't know each other, and the one was hitting on the other, right? And then the woman left the room, and the Russian guy started speaking in Russian. And he turned to me and he goes, "Oh, but you know, I mean this and that." I had no idea what he said, but he thought I did because I knew a little Russian. So here, right, like I still don't know what he said. So I don't know if it was bad or I don't know. I don't want to know, but it lets people think that I know what's going on at the very least, right? And so if anybody from Turnitin is here, I know everything that's going on. Don't listen to me, but in reality, like these little things allow me to enforce a certain level of governance that sets a precedent that makes people think that they're being watched, but watched by someone who's not a jerk, so they don't feel like I'm like their jobs aren't at stake. It's just gonna be like, come on, dude, what are you doing, right? There's no disciplinary action that I would take. So M&A is so much fun. A story about M&A, and I'm not going to mention any companies. That's happened way in the past, but I do what's called outside diligence as a security officer. Outside diligence is legal, I think, and so what you do is you evaluate the security of a potential acquisition before they give you access to look at the internals. And my outside diligence has been pretty decent, but it's actually been pretty in pair. The inside, it's actually a little more generous than the inside has been, but the inside diligence is a pain in the butt. You generally acquire a company and they're feeding you the information that they want to feed you. It's very difficult to get them to install agents on everything because they're only going to install on the good stuff, right? So you drop Orca into their cloud, boom. You get a high level risk aggregation consumable by an M&A team, which is key. It requires no work from me. I don't have to go and build this lengthy report explaining what I did. I can literally just say, pull up the Orca dashboard. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to add to this. It's not just Orca. There's a ton of other stuff we do, but Orca is one of the things that just takes a huge amount of the effort required for M&A off of my plate and makes it easier. I haven't used it for M&A at Turnitin yet, but I can't wait to. The fact that it integrates so quickly, the fact that it uses the side scanning tech, auto discovers, it doesn't require agents, and it does that risk aggregation. Just, I mean, if you work in M&A, you need this. Honestly, I've been doing M&A for a long time, and it's good. It really exposes the risks. The companies here on the right are 3 of the acquisitions that we've made at Turnitin since I've been there. I believe we've acquired many other companies, and there's more to come, hopefully. And their security is all very good. So, I'm not saying bad about them. But in the past, I saw one company that claimed that they were HIPAA compliant, and they had just put it on their website for no reason. They weren't HIPAA compliant. They didn't even need to be HIPAA compliant. but they said they were. And that was a big can of worms. Anyways, that's M&A's fun. Let's move on to the next one before I say too much.
Yeah, I think about that too. M&A, just really any scenario where you inherit an environment that you don't know much about. One of the things that I like about Orca so much is that you don't even need credentials to log into resources, right? We're looking at the disk, kind of disassembling it, reassembling it, and then scanning it for risk. So it's sort of the perfect approach to, and we're going to show you. You've talked about it. Thank you, Jack. We're going to show you in the demo how easy it is to connect to a cloud account. And from that point on, credentials or no credentials, what's in there, you don't. Orca will handle kind of all the heavy lifting for you, which is one of the things I love most about Orca, for sure.
See, that's the thing I have to emphasize. Working in DevOps for so long, it has been extremely frustrating for me to gain access into machines to which I do not have credentials. It eliminates my ability to govern those assets, and those assets are the highest risk assets in my environment. I have written many years ago, I've written scripts in the expect language. Maybe you know what that is, then you're old like me. And I've written scripts in expect to log into remote access cards, boot machines into single user mode, mount disks, create accounts for myself, reboot them, and then give me control over them. That's insane. That's ridiculous. And when I heard what Orca did, it's kind of simple. Like if you hear, I think Patrick will probably talk about the internals. I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to mess it up. But I think in the first 5 minutes when I was talking to, I think it was Avi, I was like, whoa, why didn't I think that? Like it's awesome. Anyways, let's go on to the next. So the new risks in ungoverned accounts I touched on earlier a bit. This is key because I know a lot of you out there are managing not just tens, not just hundreds, but thousands of AWS accounts, because we all love to get around that rate limiting that AWS does, because none of us like to write back off algorithms, right? But so a lot of us will deploy a lot of accounts, and that's one of the things about Orca is that I don't think the licensing model is account-based. I think it's resource-based, so that's awesome. Some of you may be familiar with account-based licensing models. I don't like that because it forces my hand to have a certain type of way that I develop. But I'm sure that we all have those 1, 2, 3, or 100 accounts that were started by a developer on a credit card, and they built something awesome, and the CTO or the CEO or somebody who is influential at the company said, that's freaking cool, I love that, let's use that, we're going to do everything with that. Next thing you know, their developer AWS account is a production AWS account, and you don't have access to almost anything in it. The one thing you can get access to is probably the account. And you do that, you drop Orca in it. Maybe there's nothing there that's sketchy right now, but maybe in the future that developer's working on a different project and he decides to make his production application call over to that other AWS account or a resource in that AWS account to do feature flagging, configuration changes, or even code deployment to bypass your CI/CD quality pipeline. It happens. Generally speaking, most people don't do that, but Orca can help you identify those rogue assets or some of the risks involved with doing that. Oh, auditors. I actually really like auditors. I'm a big audit and compliance nerd. I don't know what went wrong in my life at some point, but I can't get enough of it. And I mentioned this earlier as well, right? Like Orca does do a lot of data exposure. I think, I don't know how many SOC controls I can satisfy with it, but my current SOC audit is 164 open controls, I think. We do the availability, security, and privacy trust criteria. And for those of you who have been involved in a privacy SOC audit, you know that's a big pain in the butt. But anything that you can do to make it easy is great. Any software as a service provider, one of the things that I do when I decide to sign up for them is I vet them for, is this going to make audit and compliance easier? Because audit and compliance can be kind of cumbersome. And first and foremost, just to be clear, I think audit and compliance is great because us security professionals, we can use it to motivate positive change, or we could just let that opportunity slide by and just try and tick boxes. So the fact that Orca is able to satisfy some of these compliance initiatives also helps me justify Orca existing. but it also exposes risks and makes me consider things more seriously. There's a lot of chaos in cloud environments, and Orca does a good job there. So friction with DevOps, this is something that I don't have to deal with very much because they all work for me. But that's not true at all. My employees will tell me I'm stupid left and right if they feel that way. I'm a very easy to approach person. But when I approach them with Orca, they're skeptical. But they hate agents. I mean, I hate agents. I mean, I've written agents. It's kind of the only way I knew how to do things, really. The quick deployment, really, I make them try so much dumb stuff. If any of you guys are around here, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep doing it. And when they did Orca, it was like, boom, it was installed. I mean, even like the onboarding training session was probably completely unnecessary because the UI is so intuitive. And the one thing I really want Orca to do is help me enable more DevOps governance. So the Orca already helps me enable DevOps governance, but my DevOps team sees the opportunity for side scanning technology to increase the amount of DevOps governance that we have. And honestly, the DevSecOps term, I tried using it for a while with my team, and they were probably all ready to quit because they hated it so much. But I think that DevOps is so closely intertwined with security that having a security tool that helps out with governance, it just makes sense for that to also help out with DevOps governance. And this does do DevOps governance, absolutely. So some of the ways to, additional ways to help with friction. The culture, the shift left thing, let's talk about shift left, all right? So shift left, a lot of people think it's about guardrails, and they think it's about controls in your CI/CD pipeline. It's about making people have to assume responsibility of security. So your AppSec guys, they've got to run some sort of testing on their code before they can do anything with it. I call Orca an omnipresent tool, and it highlights some of these risks in near real time, not real time, but near real time. And that helps a cultural shift, like I was mentioning earlier. If I can expose risks, people believe me. They don't think I'm just somebody crying wolf. The tools that just provide a ton of data, and I use some of those tools, and I've heard my engineers complain about them. They're like, well, we use this thing, and I try to deploy module, and I got 43 alerts, right? All these CVEs. CVEs are all about politics. I shouldn't have said that. I didn't say that. So, but you know what I mean. Orca is that the granularity of risk, the ease of deployment, the fact that I can use it as evidence to developers or other people that I'm shift lefting security to, makes them enjoy security because it's not a whole lot of data. It's not a whole lot of crazy stuff. I mentioned this, I alluded to this very briefly, but I needed to mitigate false positive alerts when I joined Turnitin, because I joined Turnitin after a brief retirement. And I realized that I will probably never retire because I went nuts. It was like 3 months. I'm like, what am I doing? I need work. But I didn't want anything that was like too crazy. So I took this role at Turnitin, and they put me on call. So I mean, CISOs are always on call, but they put me like on, not front line, but like kind of near front line. And the stuff that we were getting alerted about was insane. So I sat the team down and I said, how many alerts do you guys get in a night? And it was ridiculous. So we had to eliminate all these false positives. And what happened was, and I was trying to explain this internally, and everybody got it, when we explained it, but the reason why we were having production instability is because there were so many false positive alerts. Our team didn't know how to prioritize what was real and what wasn't. It didn't take a lot of effort to squelch the noise. And it allowed my engineers to say, okay, I got sleep last night. Now I can do something that's proactive instead of reactive.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. I'm wondering, Jack, in the interest of time, how about we shuffle through the 5 tips, and then I can do a quick demo and sort of tie together much of what you spoke about, if that's okay. Excellent.
Perfect. Let's do them. I'll do them real quick for you guys. Ask questions. So governed assets introduce less risk than ungoverned because they're governed, right? And I keep on talking about this, but it's really important. It's a catch-22. If you have rogue assets that you don't have access to, they introduce a ton of risk. And I always, I use the term herding pets, right? Because we talk about infrastructure as cattle, right? We need the governance to turn these pets into cattle. Full scope governance, I think, is in line with this same vein. The way that I approach things in DevOps, if I don't have asset discovery, especially if I have an old data center and I'm doing M&A, is stochastic. And Orca would make it deterministic. So if I deploy something into a set of cloud environments, it deterministically identifies all of the assets there and profiles their risk. I work with risk, right? And any CISO who doesn't understand risk is probably not worth their salt. So can you go back real quick? I didn't know if that
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So again, Orca just eliminates that risk, right? Nothing's perfect, and Orca's not going to catch everything. Obviously, I would never say that to anybody, but it does help with that risk. Let's move on. All right, so mature company problems. I work for an older company, and I generally work for older companies, and we have orphan products and features. They require a ton of hands-on support from people who should be segregated from access to that production environment, but can't be because of the languages are esoteric or the infrastructure is heavily proprietary. Orca helps with the governance there, right? Because we have forced segregation of duties. We have a smaller appetite for risk than startups. We cannot deal with the level of risk that a startup is going to deal with. So least privilege is really essential for us for managing our sensitive data. We can't have too many cooks. Because we have too many cooks, then we're assuming too much risk. And the PII personal data issues, guardrails are feasible sometimes, but they're not always feasible. And roadblocks, what I call roadblocks, are like kind of a soft guardrail, so we implement it, in real time, are a way to enforce policy, satisfy audit, which is very important, but not disable our business from functioning. So duplicative PII, this is very important. I have a large database of data, right? And if a hacker were trying to target Turnitin, I mean, that's what they go for, right? I mean, get into that huge database. No, absolutely not. If I have data spread out all over the place, duplicative data, they're going to hack that. It's easier, right? I mean, we're all lazy, especially DevOps people like me. We're lazy. Analogy I use here in the slide is why break into Fort Knox when the janitor has a big batch of bullion in his bunker, right? If the janitor's closet is storing the gold too, you don't need to break through the main security. So this is why minimizing duplicative PII is very important. And breaches can have reputational risks on businesses like mine that are insurmountable. So what I call, I was thinking to call the diagonal breach. Orca uniquely can help you identify if people are storing cloud access keys or any credentials to other cloud environments that you're managing within the same cloud environment. And when I was on the other side of the, when I was playing around with trying to break into things, we didn't have these kind of clouds, so I never really thought about it. But Orca really exposes this. So in a ZTN world, we have like a new idea of lateral breach, right? Because there's no perimeter, right? I mean, we're looking at credentials and open access. So, monitor for stored SaaS and cloud credentials and infrastructure assets. And Orca does that well. One of the things I have to emphasize is the SSO tax. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term. Pay it, use the MFA, don't skip on it. And password strength, this is a fun one. So passwords are weird. These complexity requirements that Audit has are dumb. What's a weak password really? A weak password is a password that I can guess. Nobody runs password crackers anymore. They use hash table lookups, they use breach database accounts. One of the things that they'll do is they'll search breach lists for hashed passwords and then compare those hashed passwords to other accounts to try and do lateral movement. They'll find out that some users use the same password 35 times, and they'll use that to break into another one of their accounts. Orca has ties into breach lists, so it'll tell you if there are stored breached passwords in your environment. I maintain my own breach list, and it was extremely difficult to build. It has over 25 billion rows, and for those of you who are familiar with breach lists, you'll know that 25 billion rows is a shitload. But this is really important because a lot of the tools out there are looking at password complexity, rotation time, and all that. And nobody's cracking anymore. We use hash tables, right? So it's not they use hash tables. So the way that Orca is approaching this is much more sophisticated.
Okay, thank you, Jack. With that, I think we're going to try and take a look at 5 minutes or less of Orca, and I will try to tie in as much as we've talked about. We talked about a lot. We talked about, the ease of onboarding. We talked about the kinds of things that Orca finds and the way it does so. So let me take you through the product really quick. So this is your dashboard, and right away you can get a sense of the aggregation, the filtering, the contextual enrichment that Orca does, right? We have a lot of information here, but a dozen compromised and imminent compromise sorts of alerts. Let me show you real briefly what it takes to get started. Jack and I were sort of thinking about what would be the most valuable things to show. He said, oh, you've got an onboarding account. That's one of the things I love the most in terms of how easy it is. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to show you what's involved. If you're logged into your cloud console, we'll even kind of start the process for you. Basically, it's a role and a policy. You connect those, you tell how much privilege Orca can have through this integration, and away we go. It's literally done in about 2 or 3 minutes. If you've done it before, maybe in 60 seconds, right? And at that point, Orca begins to scan what we call your entire cloud estate, right? And so if you've got one, if you've got a dozen, we've had Fortune 500 companies who protected their entire cloud estate across multiple providers, in half a week. And there's really no other approach, especially to sort of host vulnerability management, that can make that claim for sure.
I did this yesterday. I had an engineer onboard an account, and I think it took him 60 seconds.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, if you're coming from the cloud security world, maybe a cloud security posture manager, that type of integration, I still think Orca's, the fastest, but that type of integration probably isn't that new. If you're coming from how you do vulnerability management, even in the cloud today, it's installing agents. First, it's discovering where your assets are, right? Orca does none of that. You connect it to the account, and it's got complete perspective over everything you run. And it begins classifying the information just like this, right? So we begin searching. I'm going to open up just a few sample kinds of alerts for you, ones that tie to what we've been talking about today, and then show you a different couple screens, and then we'll wrap up. But if we look at a malware kind of a detection alert, for example, this happens to be Windows malware. It's done on a machine that it is public, and not only is publicly addressed, but is listening on that remote administration port for Windows. So this is a compromised alert, one of course that needs to be addressed very, very soon. If we scroll down, this is probably one of the better ways to illustrate sort of context within Orca. If I open up both of these alerts, we're just going to look at them and compare them a little bit. Both of these have to do with a vulnerable, unpatched web service. This one, Orca has classified as imminent compromise. The alert right beside it, it's the same alert, but this one Orca has compromised as hazardous. Why? What's the difference? I see asset roles, they look the same. Indeed they are. The difference is in this imminent compromise alert, the machine is public, the machine is on. We didn't talk about that. Orca can actually scan your workloads even when they're not turned on. Because it works on the storage subsystem underneath that powers the workload, even if that workload's turned off, we can still absolutely mount that disk, scan it for risks, and report back to you. But this one, of course, is on, it's internet facing, and the web port, right, the port that has to do with this service is listening, is exposed. That's the difference. This machine is absolutely public as well, it's turned on, but the port that's responsible, that's tied to this vulnerability, is not accessible. Therefore, why would we risk this the same as one that's public facing, right? And so that's the difference between these two subtly different alerts, but different in how we've ranked the severity of that risk. And then we scroll on, you'll see things like weak host passwords. We talked about how Orca does this. It's a combination of methods looking in breach databases, hashes of very commonly used passwords. We'll absolutely detect that. Unsupported host operating systems, that's a real key one, right? Because we look at vulnerabilities of aging software, but here's this kind of alert is similar, but you've got an OS that's fallen out of support that can't be patched. That's a slightly different kind of risk profile than one that simply hasn't been patched, right? So we call those out separately for sure. we'll do some measurements outside of the workloads as well. So we'll talk about IAM policy. Jack, you mentioned, the SSO tax, making sure that you're using features like MFA, making sure that you're using accounts that aren't privileged or overly privileged for day-to-day use. That's the kind of thing that we will alert on as well. And then some findings that sort of speak to lateral movement, insecure private keys, passwords, and shell history. We know these are definitely not best practices, but we also know that people do them, right? And so Orca, through that side scanning process, will identify all of these. And in fact, this is probably a good opportunity. I'll do this, and then I'll hand it back to our host. Another way to look at this information, I mean, right now we're sort of scrolling through the list of what Orca found, lots of value there, but if we pivot to the alerts tab, we'll see that we can also sort of group these based on alert types. And what I like to often do is think about a sample scenario. Lateral movement's a really good one, and we can sort of select all of the alert types that speak to that, right? So insecure private keys, passwords and shell histories, sensitive AWS keys. I love the term kind of diagonal or cross movement, right? Because it's not just lateral, it's not just across the network anymore. If I embed keys in a script out of convenience in a workload, if those keys carry enough privilege, and there's lots of associated concepts like blast radius and least privilege, if they carry enough privilege, right, I don't need the network at all. I'll log into the cloud control plane and understand everything you do, right? So these are the kinds of things. So we can select all of these, click OK, and have Orca kind of report to us on all of those scenarios that concern us to do with lateral movement. So it depends a little bit on the interface you're using, right? If you're sort of walking through the latest findings, the dashboard's the right interface. But if you have certain questions you'd like to ask of Orca findings, alerts is definitely the right interface. Assets, we talked about inventory. Jack mentioned we do that as well. And then lastly, we'll just touch a little bit on compliance. So proving to auditors is important. Proving to ourselves is important as well. And so, we look at the operating system. Are we following best practices from a CIS perspective? Things like, are we serving FTP? Are we configuring temporary storage properly? Local sort of password and credential kinds of scenarios. We looked at some cloud plane kind of measurements as well. So the compliance tab is useful for both kind of operating system measurements, but then also measurements at the cloud control plane as well. I know I don't think I've ever done a demo in 5 minutes, but that is an Orca crash course for sure. Try to tie in some of the things that we spoke about, but we'd love to spend more time with you looking at your particular case and showing you how Orca can help.
Well, it was certainly a very, very quick demo, but also one that gave everybody a nice flavor of the technology. So thanks for that, Patrick. We're actually 3 minutes to the top of the hour. I think we're going to have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. So let us go ahead and just dive right on into what we've got. Okay, here's one. You mentioned using host-based IDS. Isn't it better to use an IPS or a SIM, Security Information Event Management System instead?
Before you answer that, Jack, you had a SIM slide that I skipped to get to our five tips. So let me say that for sure, because it's not Jack's fault.
I hate SIM. I don't like SIM. If you have enough human resources that can manage the SIM and effectively filter through all of the data, absolutely. An IPS and SIM combination are great. A host-based IDS is complementary to DevOps because host-based IDSs generally have rule configurations, and those rule configurations can be defined very granularly to enforce all sorts of different things. They can highlight certain risks. They're very powerful. I use Slack as my SIM. I'll tell you a really quick story. A long time ago, I was working for a company that was a more mature company, and Splunk was not, Splunk was not a very mature company. They are now, they're great. Nobody uses them. They quoted me, I think it was like $6 or $8 million for just my SIM. We were processing so much data, it was infeasible. And with that $6 or $8 million requires the headcount, the human resources, to either do ETL and look at the data, or aggregate and look at the data, or look at the data. I mean, it's a lot of work. But yeah, it's great. If you could do it, awesome. That's more a small company kind of thing, I think.
All right, great. So let's do one more question, then we'll close it out. In an environment with limited network bandwidth, installed agents in a configuration management tool assists in the efficient collation systems metrics for analysis. So how does Agentless Orca thrive in these given environments? My assumptions are based around Chef's inspect tool.
It's a good question. I mean, you talk about the network bandwidth. I know we're short of time, but one of the things that Orca sort of benefits from is almost lack of connectivity, right? Compared to other solutions. So if you think about agents or network scanners, as the question referenced, they do require the network, you know, in terms of reporting their findings back to kind of a central authority, if you will. And Orca purposefully does not, right? Because I was building a lab the other day, trying to showcase some of this and do some competitive comparisons, and we had a completely private subnet that had no ability to sort of phone home. Orca does absolutely fine with this, of course, because it's a top-down kind of from the cloud control plane, not necessarily from the network perspective that we do all the side scanning. So it fares very, very well, especially, you know, if you've got bandwidth restrictions or the fact that, you know, your network architecture means you can't pull information outside. Orca does very, very well. And then I think the second half of that question's more around sort of connecting to configuration management and reporting, and Jack touched a bit on that in his presentation as well.
All right, great. Well, as the clock ticks down, we are unfortunately out of time for question and answer period, but I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. If we didn't get to your question, please know that the folks at Orca Security will be getting a copy of all of the questions, and they will be more than happy to follow up with you offline, I'm sure. Real quick, before we close things out, I did mention that we would be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So let's do that real quick. Our winners today are Dan F, Julie K, Phil W, Ryan P, Stan T, and Michael S. So congratulations to all of you. We'll be reaching out to you via email to get your gift card out to you. So please check your inbox. Want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will be able to access it again following today's webinar. As I said earlier, Orca Security will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website, so you can always go find it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Patrick and Jack, both, thank you so much. Great presentation, lots of fun anecdotes, and lots of great technology on display. So thanks a bunch, really appreciate your time.
Thank you, it's our pleasure.
Happy to be here.
All right, all right. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.